Some cars were built, tested, and ready to hit the roads. Then suddenly they were gone. No explanations, no records, just whispers of their existence. Were they too powerful, too dangerous, or did they threaten something bigger? These 12 American machines disappeared without a trace. But today, their secrets are finally being uncovered. The 1957 DeSoto Adventurer was one of the most overlooked yet fascinating performance luxury cars of its time. My dad had one, and I'll never forget the way he talked about it, like it was some kind of mythical beast. He always said that back in the day, it was the fastest car in town, and I believe him. It wasn't just about raw speed, though. This car had presence. It had style. It had an undeniable aura of exclusivity that made it stand out, even in an era filled with flamboyant, chrome-laden land yachts. DeSoto was Chrysler's upscale mid-tier brand, positioned between Dodge and Chrysler itself. And by the mid-1950s, they were producing some truly beautiful automobiles. But when they introduced the Adventurer in 1956 as their high-performance flagship model, they went all out. This wasn't just another luxury car. It was DeSoto's answer to the Chrysler 300C, a high-powered, limited-production grand tourer that combined raw muscle with top-tier comfort. Unlike the more pedestrian DeSoto models, the Adventurer was built for speed, and it looked the part. The most recognizable feature was a distinctive gold anodized trim, which ran along the body and adorned the wheel covers. While most cars of the era went for conventional chrome or painted accents, the Adventurer's gold detailing made it instantly recognizable. It was bold, flashy, and absolutely gorgeous. But the real story was under the hood. The 1957 Adventurer came equipped with a 345 cubic inch Hemi V8 fed by dual 4-barrel carburetors, producing a massive 345 horsepower, an astonishing figure for the time. Keep in mind, this was an era when most sedans were struggling to make half that. The Adventurer wasn't just fast for a DeSoto, it was one of the most powerful American cars on the road. It had more horsepower than the Chevrolet Corvette, more than the Ford Thunderbird, and it wasn't far behind Chrysler's own 300C, which had 375 horsepower. This was an honest-to-goodness muscle car before the muscle car era had even begun. Driving one of these was an experience like no other. My dad used to say that the moment you turned the key, you could feel the power pulsing through the car. The dual quad carburetors meant that throttle response was immediate. Pressing the gas pedal resulted in a deep, thunderous roar as the Hemi woke up and threw you back into the plush leather seats. The Adventurer wasn't just about straight-line speed, though. Despite its size, it handled surprisingly well for a big luxury coupe. The heavy-duty suspension gave it a stable ride, and the power steering made it easier to handle than you'd expect. The push-button torque-flight automatic transmission was a novelty at the time, allowing for effortless shifting. The car felt modern, sophisticated, and just plain fast. However, DeSoto's Golden Rocket had one major problem: timing. By the late 1950s, the entire DeSoto brand was on shaky ground. Sales had been declining for years, and Chrysler was looking for ways to streamline its lineup. While the Adventurer was an incredible car, it was also expensive, and with the country heading into a recession in 1958, luxury performance cars were becoming harder to sell. The Chrysler 300 series was stealing the spotlight, and the Adventurer never quite got the recognition it deserved. By 1961, Chrysler decided to pull the plug on DeSoto entirely, and just like that, the Adventurer was gone. To make matters worse, because DeSoto as a brand was disappearing, many of these cars didn't get the kind of preservation and restoration efforts that other muscle luxury cars received. Most of them ended up either scrapped, left to rust, or had their powerful Hemis ripped out and swapped into hot rods. Unlike the Chrysler 300, which became a collector's dream, the Adventurer faded into obscurity. Today, finding an original 1957 DeSoto Adventurer in good condition is next to impossible. They're out there, but they're rare. So rare that when one does show up at a car show, it draws a crowd of people wondering, what is that? Looking back, the Adventurer was a car ahead of its time. It was fast, luxurious, and packed with innovation. But it was also a victim of bad luck and poor corporate decisions. If Chrysler had marketed it better, or if DeSoto had survived just a few more years, maybe the Adventurer would be mentioned in the same breath as the Chrysler 300 or the Cadillac Eldorado. Instead, it remains a hidden gem, a car known only to true enthusiasts and collectors. My dad always said he regretted selling his, and I don't blame him. Owning an Adventurer today would be like owning a piece of lost history, one of the last great American luxury performance cars before the muscle car era officially began. This 1961 Mercury Comet was one of those cars that existed in the background, never stealing the spotlight, but quietly serving as an everyday workhorse. I learned to drive in one, a simple two-door sedan with no flashy features, no high-performance V8, and no prestige attached to its name. It wasn't a muscle car, it wasn't a luxury car, and it wasn't exactly a household name. But for me, it was my first taste of independence, a car that gave me the freedom to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. It might not have been exciting, but it was reliable, easy to work on, and surprisingly quick for what it was. The Comet's history is one of misdirection and survival. It wasn't originally intended to be a Mercury at all. Ford had developed it as an Edsel, a last-ditch effort to save the struggling brand by introducing a compact, affordable alternative to its massive, gas-guzzling sedans. But by 1960, the writing was on the wall for Edsel, and Ford pulled the plug on the entire division. That left the Comet without a home, and rather than scrapping a fully developed model, Ford handed it over to Mercury. That's why the earliest Comets didn't even have Mercury badging. They were born out of necessity, not strategy. Despite this rocky start, the Comet was a solid little car. It shared its underpinnings with the Ford Falcon, another compact car that was making waves at the time. But while the Falcon would go on to become a legend as the direct ancestor of the Mustang, the Comet always seemed to exist in its shadow. It was a little longer, slightly more upscale, and had unique styling features, like small tail fins and oval taillights that set it apart from the more utilitarian Falcon. But in an era when Americans still preferred big, powerful cars, a slightly fancier compact wasn't exactly what the market was asking for. Driving my '61 Comet was an experience in itself. It had the optional 170 cubic inch inline-six, an upgrade from the standard 144, and while it wasn't a powerhouse, it had a surprising amount of pep. It wasn't going to win any drag races, but it could keep up with traffic just fine. The car was light, and because it had unibody construction, a relatively new concept for American cars, it handled decently for the time. The steering was light, the ride was smooth enough for a compact, and there was a simplicity to it that made it easy to work on. It didn't have any power accessories, but that meant fewer things to break. The biggest issue the Comet faced was that compact cars weren't seen as classics back then. In the early '60s, Americans wanted cars that made a statement. Big convertibles with tail fins, powerful V8s, and high-end styling were what people aspired to own. Compact cars were bought out of necessity, not desire. If you could afford something bigger, you went bigger. The Comet was never considered a car that you'd show off. It was just a sensible way to get from point A to point B. That's why most of them didn't survive. They were used up, rusted out, or scrapped when they got too old to be worth fixing. The Falcon at least had the distinction of being the Mustang's predecessor, but the Comet? It was largely forgotten. You go to classic Ford shows today, and you'll see rows of restored Mustangs, Thunderbirds, and even a few Falcons. But the Comet is almost never there. It's as if it was erased from history. But looking back, I think the Comet deserves more credit. It was reliable, economical, and ahead of its time in many ways. It might not have been as iconic as the Mustang or as beloved as the Falcon, but for those of us who drove them, it was part of our story. I wish I had kept mine, not because it would be valuable today, but because it represented an era of simplicity and honesty in American cars. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It was just a good, dependable car. And in a world where everything now is about performance, luxury, or technology, there's something refreshing about that kind of straightforwardness. The '61 Comet may be forgotten by most, but for those of us who remember them, they'll always have a place in automotive history. The 1968 AMC Ambassador SST was a car that didn't get the recognition it deserved. It was never a headline grabber like the Javelin or AMX, and it didn't have the muscle car status of a Chevelle SS or a Charger RT, but for those who knew what they had, the Ambassador SST was a sleeper, a full-size car with the heart of a performance machine. I had one back in the late 70s, a dark blue two-door SST with a 343 V8 and a 4-barrel carburetor. Back then, it was just another old car to most people, but I saw something in it. AMC had always been an underdog, but that didn't mean they weren't building some incredible cars. The Ambassador SST was proof of that. The name might have suggested luxury, but when you got behind the wheel and hit the gas, it was clear this thing had some muscle under the hood. The 343 was one of AMC's best engines, 280 horsepower in stock form, but with a few tweaks, you could push that higher. It wasn't the biggest engine you could get in an Ambassador, the 390 was the top dog option, but it was plenty to move that full-size body with authority. It had torque for days, and if you knew how to tune it right, it could give a lot of so-called muscle cars a run for their money. I had a buddy with a '69 Camaro RS SS 350, and he thought he was king of the street until I pulled up next to him one night. Light turns green, I floor it, and that Ambassador hooked up and shot forward like a car half its size. He caught up eventually, but the look on his face said it all. He never expected that kind of speed from an AMC. That was the thing about the Ambassador SST. It had the bones of a muscle car, but nobody saw it that way. It was marketed as a full-size luxury car, something to compete with the Ford LTD or Chevy Caprice. AMC gave it a longer wheelbase, a smooth ride, and an interior that was a step above their smaller models. My SST had bucket seats, a floor shifter, and one of the best dashboards of any late 60s car. The hidden headlights gave it a sleek, aggressive look, and the body lines were clean, almost European in a way. It was a damn good-looking car, but AMC never had the advertising power of the big three, so cars like the Ambassador R never got the attention they should have. The problem was nobody saved them. You go to a classic car show today, and you'll see Mustangs, Camaros, Chargers, and Chevelles everywhere. Even some of the rarer AMC models like the Javelin and AMX show up from time to time. But an Ambassador R? Forget about it. It's like they vanished. Most of them were daily drivers that got used up, rusted away, or got junked when they became just another old car that nobody wanted. Part of it was the reputation of AMC itself. They were seen as the alternative car company, the small brand trying to compete with the giants. Their cars were often underrated, but they never had the massive following that Ford, Chevy, or Dodge had. And when the collector market took off in the 80s and 90s, people were looking for muscle cars, not full-size AMCs. It didn't matter that an Ambassador SST with a 390 could outrun a lot of the more famous muscle cars. Nobody was paying attention. Even the performance versions were overlooked. AMC built police spec Ambassadors with the 390 V8, and those cars were absolute monsters. Some departments used them because they were cheaper than Ford or Chevy alternatives, but still packed plenty of power. Imagine a big four-door cruiser with nearly 400 pound-feet of torque, chasing down speeders on the highway. But even those disappeared, either retired and scrapped or just driven into the ground. If I could go back, I'd have kept mine. Not because it's worth a fortune now, because it isn't, but because it was a car that deserved better than to be forgotten. The '68 Ambassador SST was comfortable, powerful, and had more character than a lot of the more famous cars of its time. It might not have had the name recognition of a GTO or a Roadrunner, but it was every bit as much fun to drive. Now, trying to find one in good shape is like searching for a needle in a haystack. They weren't collectible, so people didn't preserve them. Even when you do find one, it's usually in rough shape, sitting in a barn somewhere with rust eating away at the fenders. But for those of us who were lucky enough to own one, the memory sticks with you. It was one of those cars that didn't need to be flashy to make an impression. It just needed the right driver to bring out its potential. That's the story of AMC, really. Always the underdog, always overlooked, but always building cars that had more to offer than people realized. The Ambassador SST was one of their hidden gems, and if you ever get the chance to drive one, you'll understand exactly what I mean. The 1970 Chevrolet Kingswood Estate Wagon is a car that, for anyone who grew up with one, represents an era of family road trips, endless summer vacations, and the kind of carefree travel that only a massive station wagon could provide. It's hard to believe now, in a world dominated by minivans and SUVs, that the station wagon once reigned supreme as the ultimate family vehicle. But back then, if you had a Kingswood Estate in your driveway, you had a piece of American automotive history, a car built for comfort, space, and a little bit of adventure. Our family had a 1980 Kingswood Estate wagon when I was a kid, and I can still vividly recall the first time I saw it in our driveway. It was a massive car, almost like a small bus compared to the sedans and compact cars that everyone else drove at the time. It came in a deep forest green with those iconic faux wood paneling sides, which at the time felt like the epitome of suburban luxury. It was the kind of car that made you feel like you were on a grand road trip, even if you were just driving to the grocery store. The first thing you noticed about the Kingswood was its size. It was huge. The sheer dimensions of it made it stand out from any car on the road. Inside, there was room for the whole family and then some. The front bench seat could fit 3 adults comfortably, and the second row had enough space to make you forget what personal space meant. But it was the back that really set it apart. The third row jump seats that folded out from the rear made it feel like an actual living space on wheels. Sitting back there, you could see everything behind you: mountains, forests, dunes, while your parents navigated long stretches of highway. It made every trip feel like an adventure, no matter how mundane the destination. Under the hood, the Kingswood was no slouch. Ours came with the 400 cubic inch V8, which was a real powerhouse for a family car. That engine had torque to spare, and for a big, heavy wagon, it moved surprisingly well. It wasn't exactly a muscle car, but in a way it was. After all, you couldn't just stuff that kind of engine into anything and expect it to coast. Even without the muscle car label, it had a way of surprising people at stoplights. I remember my dad flooring it once on a highway on-ramp, and the car just shot forward with a power I didn't expect from something so large. At the time, nobody thought of it as a performance vehicle, but in hindsight, it was definitely a sleeper. But as the 1970s wore on, things started to change. Gas prices were on the rise, and the fuel crisis made people start questioning their love affair with big block V8s. The era of large, gas-guzzling family cars was coming to an end. By the late 70s, the Kingswood's massive size was starting to feel more like a burden than a luxury. It was no longer practical in the world of rising fuel prices and tighter emissions regulations. The Kingswood, once a staple of the American family car, was slowly becoming a relic of a bygone era. In the mid-80s, my parents made the decision to trade in the Kingswood for something more fuel-efficient and practical: our family's first minivan. I still remember the day it left our driveway. The car that had been with us through so many memories was suddenly gone. I wasn't old enough to fully grasp what it meant at the time, but looking back now, I realized that it was more than just a family car. It was part of a lifestyle, a symbol of road trips, summer days, and an America that was rapidly changing. It wasn't just a car, it was part of our family's story. Over the years, as SUVs took over the role that wagons once had, the Kingswood, like so many other station wagons, faded into the background. Most of these big wagons got used up, rusted out, or were crushed. They were replaced by minivans and, later, SUVs, which offered more practicality and modern features. The once king of the American road, the station wagon, was slowly forgotten. Now, when you see an old Chevy wagon like the Kingswood, it's usually a shadow of what it once was. If you find one still in decent condition, it's either a rare survivor that's been lovingly restored or a project car that's been picked over for parts. At a car show, you might catch a glimpse of a restored Kingswood, but those instances are few and far between. It's almost like these cars never existed in the first place. For most people, station wagons are a joke, something to laugh at from a time when cars were big, inefficient, and impractical. But for those of us who remember them, the Kingswood Estate Wagon and others like it were the ultimate family cars. They were more than just transportation. They were the backdrop to so many memories. If I could, I would love to take a ride in one again, just to feel the rumble of that V8, hear the wind rushing through the open windows, and experience that feeling of limitless space and adventure that only a car like the Kingswood could provide. The 1964 Studebaker Daytona, one of the final products of a company whose days were numbered, remains an enigmatic relic from a bygone era. For many, it's almost as though the Daytona and its performance legacy were swept under the rug, forgotten in the shadow of more well-known muscle cars like the Mustang, Camaro, or GTO. Yet, in its own right, the Daytona was a powerful statement, a bold attempt by a nearly bankrupt company to capture a piece of the muscle car craze that had taken America by storm in the early 1960s. The Daytona was part of the Studebaker's last attempt to stay competitive in an ever-evolving automotive landscape. The company, founded in the early 1900s, had already begun to decline long before the Daytona was even conceived. By the time this car hit the streets, Studebaker was fighting an uphill battle against the industry giants, Ford, Chevy, and Chrysler. The Daytona, however, was a valiant effort to carve out a niche in the increasingly crowded performance car market. What set the Daytona apart from other vehicles of the time was not just its sleek design, but the performance it could offer. Available with the supercharged 289 V8 engine, the Daytona was an unexpected competitor to some of the biggest muscle cars on the market. With its raw power and surprisingly quick acceleration, it could outpace early muscle cars like the Mustang and even challenge more powerful vehicles in straight-line speed. Despite its unassuming exterior, the Daytona was an undiscovered gem in terms of its mechanical potential. It was an agile and responsive car, able to rival the best performance cars of its day, even though it was produced by a company in financial ruin. Unfortunately, because of Studebaker's dire situation, the Daytona was severely underappreciated. The company was on the verge of closing its doors, and despite the quality of the car, it never got the necessary marketing or attention it deserved. By 1963, the writing was already on the wall, with Studebaker closing its U.S. production plants. The car industry, much like the rest of the American economy, was booming, but Studebaker was out of sync with this rise, unable to sustain itself. In 1964, when the Daytona was released, Studebaker's brand was already on the decline. And while the Daytona may have boasted some impressive statistics and striking styling, it faced the crushing reality of poor timing. The American public was flocking to the new offerings from the big three automakers, all of whom were pushing out cars that were better marketed and already had a solid following. Studebaker, by contrast, lacked the financial muscle to push his product effectively. The Daytona came too late, and by the time its potential was truly understood, it was already a forgotten footnote in automotive history. The Daytona's unique styling, especially its low-slung profile and aggressive stance, was distinctive for its time, and it looked every bit the part of a performance car. But the problems of timing and poor public perception meant that this impressive machine never had the chance to earn its rightful place in the pantheon of great muscle cars. Few were made and fewer were preserved as Studebaker closed its doors. Those who bought one in 1964 were not only purchasing a vehicle, they were witnessing the death throes of an automotive legend. As Studebaker folded, many of these cars were abandoned, scrapped, or simply forgotten as they were overshadowed by more popular and mass-produced alternatives. Today, finding a 1964 Studebaker Daytona is akin to stumbling upon a lost treasure. It's a rarity, a nearly mythical vehicle that most automotive enthusiasts are unfamiliar with, simply because it didn't survive the crash of its brand. It wasn't marketed aggressively, it didn't come with a cult following, and it never had the chance to become an icon. For those who remember the Daytona, however, it represents the end of an era, the last vestiges of a once great company that tried to make a lasting mark and with one of the finest cars it ever built. The Daytona's performance was more than just impressive. It was unexpected. It had the power, agility, and drive that could have made it a true contender in the American muscle car wars. Had Studebaker been able to survive a few more years, or had the Daytona been given more exposure and a better platform, it might have been regarded as a classic. But in the harsh reality of the 1960s, where consolidation, economic factors, and consumer preferences ruled the day, the Daytona was doomed from the start. For anyone lucky enough to have driven or owned a 1964 Studebaker Daytona, the memories remain clear. They recall the shock of its power and the smooth, responsive handling. They remember the pride of driving a car that, even though it was destined to be forgotten by the masses, offered something special that was difficult to find in other vehicles of the time. The 1959 Edsel Corsair, one of the final models to roll off the assembly line before the Edsel brand's sudden collapse, has become a symbol of both ambition and failure in the world of American cars. It's a car that embodies the lofty dreams of a brand that was meant to be a cornerstone of Ford's vision, yet was doomed by a series of poor decisions, misunderstood designs, and a market that never embraced it. When my grandfather bought the Edsel Corsair brand new, it was supposed to be the pinnacle of Ford's innovation, an upscale luxury car that could compete with the likes of Cadillac and Lincoln, all while incorporating advanced engineering and features. The Corsair was meant to bridge the gap between Ford's standard models and the high-end offerings of luxury brands. The idea seemed brilliant, and for a brief moment, the Edsel was marketed as the car of the future, one that promised style, comfort, and innovation. However, despite its solid engineering, the Edsel Corsair and its siblings never stood a chance against a market that wasn't ready for them. The styling was polarizing, to say the least. With its signature horse-collar grille and overly sculpted body, the Edsel looked like nothing else on the road. It was either loved or hated, but in the end, the latter prevailed. Ford's marketing of the Edsel also added to its downfall, with the brand being overhyped and failing to meet the high expectations it set. The car was released with a tremendous amount of fanfare, but when it hit the streets, it fell short of the promise that had been made to potential buyers. For my grandfather, the first few months with the Edsel Corsair were exciting. The car was comfortable, smooth to drive, and packed with modern features for its time. But soon enough, the reality of Edsel's demise set in. Parts became scarce as the brand's future grew increasingly uncertain. Ford made a sudden decision to abandon the brand, leaving owners like my grandfather with an orphan car that no longer had any backing. Dealerships stopped selling Edsel parts, mechanics had difficulty servicing them, and the promised luxury of the Corsair began to feel more like a burden than a blessing. Over time, as Edsel's reputation continued to plummet and the brand became a cautionary tale, people grew disillusioned with their cars. The once promising fleet of Edsels, including the Corsair, quickly ended up in junkyards. The cars were discarded, forgotten, and left to rust away. Some were lucky enough to be preserved, finding their way to collectors who saw value in them, not for their performance or luxury, but for their place in automotive history. Today, you might still see an Edsel Corsair at a car show, but it's a rare sight. These cars are like ghosts, their once grand promises now faded into history. Many of them were simply wiped out, discarded by owners who no longer had the resources or desire to maintain a brand that was gone before it could truly shine. The Corsair was supposed to be a mid-tier luxury option in the Edsel lineup, but it became a reminder of what happens when innovation and ambition collide with an unprepared market. The Edsel brand, despite its early promise, was a colossal failure, and the Corsair was caught in the middle of that downfall. While some people still defend the Edsel for its engineering or its attempts to push the envelope, the reality is that it was an idea ahead of its time, misunderstood, mismanaged, and ultimately abandoned by its parent company. For my grandfather, who adored the Corsair, its abandonment was a painful experience, one that made him view the car in a different light. What had once been a symbol of luxury and style became a symbol of disappointment. Today, the Edsel Corsair and the entire Edsel lineup stand as a lesson in both ambition and failure. The brand's history serves as a reminder of how even the most well-engineered and innovative cars can fall victim to bad timing, poor marketing, in a changing market that leaves them behind. The Edsel, once heralded as the future of Ford's high-end offerings, ended up as one of the most famous automotive failures in history. And while some enthusiasts continue to cherish the few surviving models, the Edsel Corsair's legacy will forever be tied to the story of a brand that had everything except the market's approval. The 1969 Dodge Polara 500 convertible is one of those classic muscle cars that didn't quite fit into the narrative of the muscle car era, but in doing so, it became one of the most overlooked and underappreciated vehicles of its time. Dodge had the foresight to create a full-size car with the muscle of its smaller counterparts. But the result was a vehicle that few could fully appreciate, and even fewer preserve for the future. The Polara 500 wasn't a typical muscle car. When you think of muscle cars from the late 1960s, you probably picture lean, fast, and aggressive machines like the Dodge Charger, Ford Mustang, or Plymouth Roadrunner. Or cars designed to make a statement with their sharp lines, compact bodies, and big engines that made them kings of the street. But the Polara 500, a full-size convertible with a 440 Magnum V8, didn't fit that mold. Its large frame, long body, and luxurious features seemed at odds with the raw power and athleticism of muscle cars. Yet under the hood, it had the heart of a muscle car with all the performance you'd expect from a muscle-bound sedan. I first got behind the wheel of a 1969 Polara 500 when I was young, and I couldn't help but feel that I had stumbled upon a hidden treasure. The 440 Magnum engine offered remarkable acceleration, and when you pushed the pedal to the floor, the car responded with an impressive roar. It was like a sleeper, big, seemingly unassuming, but capable of extraordinary speed and power. It wasn't quite as agile as a smaller muscle car like the Mustang or Charger, but that didn't stop it from being a blast to drive. It could still burn rubber with the best of them, but in a more refined, effortless way that felt like a true full-size muscle car. Despite the raw power under the hood, the Polara was never treated with the same reverence as the iconic muscle cars of the era. The full-size body was seen as a disadvantage at the time. Muscle cars were all about agility, speed, and handling, and full-size cars like the Polara 500 didn't fit that ideal. It was almost too big for the time, and despite the great engine, it lacked the aggressive stance and sharp handling that defined other muscle cars. But the Polara 500 still had what mattered most: the engine. The 440 Magnum was a powerhouse, capable of pushing the car to speeds that made even the most iconic muscle cars of the day sit up and take notice. But by 1970, the tides had begun to change. Muscle cars were facing increasing restrictions due to new emissions regulations, rising insurance costs, and skyrocketing gas prices. What was once considered the pinnacle of American automotive design was now rapidly becoming a liability. The Polara 500, despite its impressive power, didn't fit into the changing landscape of the automotive world. Full-size cars were becoming less and less desirable as fuel efficiency and practicality became the focus. As fuel prices rose and the energy crisis loomed, larger cars like the Polara 500 were seen as inefficient, impractical, and increasingly undesirable. It didn't help that smaller, more fuel-efficient cars were beginning to flood the market. For many, the Polara 500 simply wasn't the type of car they could justify owning in an increasingly frugal world. Gas-guzzling muscle cars were quickly being replaced by more practical options, and the Polara 500 was left behind. Those who owned them either traded them in for more practical vehicles, let them rust away, or simply scrapped them when they became too costly to maintain. The Polara 500, with its muscular engine and heavy frame, became yet another casualty of an era that no longer had room for such vehicles. By the mid-1970s, the Polara was a rarity. Dodge had stopped production on the full-size muscle car, and the market had shifted towards smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. The Polara 500 disappeared from the streets, and as the years went on, fewer and fewer examples were left on the road. The car that had once been a hidden gem in the muscle car world had become a forgotten relic of the past. Today, trying to find a well-preserved 1969 Dodge Polara 500 convertible is akin to hunting for treasure. Most of them were either wrecked, rusted out, or simply abandoned. I still remember how special it felt to drive that car. There was a rawness to it that modern muscle cars just don't have. It wasn't about fancy design or sleek aerodynamics. It was about power. When you put your foot down, it didn't matter that the car was big and heavy. It would pull ahead with a force that made you feel like you were in the cockpit of a fighter jet. It was a car that demanded respect, even if most people didn't realize it at the time. But that's the tragedy of the Polara 500. It was too much of a hybrid, too large for muscle car enthusiasts, too rough for luxury car buyers, and too thirsty for a world that was moving towards smaller, more economical cars. Today, it's an underappreciated part of automotive history. The 1974 Buick Apollo GSX is one of those unique muscle cars that almost slipped completely through the cracks of history. It was a model that had the potential to be remembered as a key player in the muscle car era, yet it was overshadowed by the larger, more powerful, and more iconic muscle machines of its time. Buick, a brand known primarily for its upscale, luxurious cars, took a bold step with the Apollo GSX, hoping to carve out a niche in the compact muscle car segment. However, despite its impressive performance and sporty features, the Apollo GSX never gained the widespread recognition it deserved. The Apollo GSX was an ambitious experiment by Buick to bring muscle car performance to a smaller, more economical package. The standard Buick Apollo was a compact car, often overlooked in the shadow of larger, more famous muscle cars from the Big Three. Buick's answer to the demand for compact performance came in the form of the GSX package, which included the 350 cubic inch V8 engine, an upgrade over the base engine options, and a host of performance-oriented features. These included a heavy-duty suspension system, sportier styling cues, and a more aggressive stance that helped distinguish the GSX from the standard Apollo. But despite these improvements, the Apollo GSX never really caught the public's eye. A significant reason for this was timing. By the mid-70s, the muscle car era was rapidly coming to a close. The government had begun implementing stricter emissions regulations, insurance rates for muscle cars were skyrocketing, and gas prices were climbing steadily. The combination of these factors led to a dramatic shift in consumer priorities. Muscle cars, once the kings of American streets, were suddenly impractical and expensive to own. The public was increasingly turning to more fuel-efficient, family-friendly vehicles, like compact sedans, station wagons, and soon-to-be popular minivans. The larger muscle cars, such as the Chevrolet Chevelle SS, Pontiac GTO, and Buick Skylark GSX, had established reputations and loyal followings. Their big block V8 engines, aggressive styling, and street racing history made them the darlings of muscle car enthusiasts. But the Apollo GSX was competing for attention in a shrinking market, and its compact size and smaller engine didn't allow it to stand out the way its larger counterparts did. Despite its performance chops, the Apollo GSX never achieved the same level of fame, and it didn't have the legacy that other muscle cars enjoyed. One of the key issues for the Apollo GSX was simply that it didn't appeal to the same type of car enthusiast who coveted the big muscle cars. Muscle car owners at the time often prioritized raw power and presence, qualities that the Apollo GSX couldn't match in the same way that a Chevelle or a Mustang could. Its compact size, while offering better fuel economy and handling, made it less desirable for those seeking the brute force and in-your-face styling that defined the muscle car era. While the Apollo GSX could certainly hold its own on the road, it never had the same street presence, and as a result, it never attracted the same kind of passionate following. Another reason for the Apollo GSX's disappearance is simply the lack of marketing and exposure. Buick, as a brand, wasn't known for building muscle cars at the time. The company had a much stronger reputation for building luxury cars like the Electra and Riviera. In contrast, Chevrolet and Pontiac had a long history of producing high-performance vehicles that had already garnered substantial fan bases. The Apollo GSX, despite its potential, was largely ignored by Buick's marketing team, who were more focused on their larger, more successful models. The Apollo, as a compact model, was never given the same level of attention or hype that cars like the Skylark or Chevelle received. The final nail in the Apollo GSX's coffin came when the muscle car era began to fade in the late 1970s. By 1975, the era of large, powerful engines was all but over. The federal government had cracked down on emissions, and fuel efficiency had become a critical factor in purchasing decisions. Muscle cars with their big block engines were no longer feasible for most people, and the market for such cars evaporated. The Apollo GSX, already a niche offering, was discontinued after just one model year. The timing couldn't have been worse for the car, as it was born into a world that was quickly losing its taste for the loud, powerful cars that had once ruled the streets. In terms of production numbers, The Apollo GSX was already a rare car when it was first released. Buick produced only a small number of them, and with the changing consumer tastes, fewer and fewer were preserved. As the years went on, the few remaining examples were either neglected, wrecked, or scrapped. Most owners traded them in for more practical vehicles as muscle cars fell out of favor. The 1955 Hudson Hornet V8 marked the final chapter in the storied history of one of America's most ambitious car manufacturers. Hudson had been a prominent name in the automotive world, especially known for its racing success in NASCAR during the early 1950s. The Hornet, originally introduced in 1951, was one of the dominant forces in stock car racing. Its unique design, excellent engineering, and powerful six-cylinder engine made it nearly unbeatable on the tracks, especially during its peak years. However, by 1955, the once dominant Hudson brand was in serious decline. The Hudson Hornet had always been associated with power, agility, and innovative design. When it came to NASCAR, the Hornet was a symbol of American muscle and performance. It was engineered for speed, with its low center of gravity and advanced suspension system, which made it an ideal competitor in racing. But by the mid-50s, a combination of changing consumer tastes, a shift in automotive technology, and the rising competition from Detroit's big three brands, Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler, left Hudson struggling to stay relevant. The Hornet's dominance in racing began to fade, and the brand could not keep pace with the industry's ever-changing demands. In 1955, Hudson introduced a new version of the Hornet, this time equipped with a V8 engine, in an attempt to modernize and save the brand. The new engine was an important step forward, as the automotive world was quickly moving toward more powerful V8 engines, and Hudson was eager to show it could keep up. The V8 in the 1955 Hornet was a solid, respectable engine, offering around 190 horsepower, which was a significant increase over the previous six-cylinder models. Despite the improvements, it was still clear that the Hornet, and Hudson as a whole, was far behind the curve when it came to competing with the more established manufacturers who were flooding the market with new and improved vehicles. But the introduction of the V8 was, unfortunately, too little, too late. Hudson was facing a perfect storm of financial instability, shifting consumer preferences, and the rise of larger, more established competitors who had more resources to pour into marketing, design, and innovation. The Hornet's new V8 engine didn't bring the sales boost the company hoped for, and in 1955, Hudson's fate was sealed. The brand was absorbed into the American Motors Corporation, AMC, marking the end of its independent existence. The 1955 Hudson Hornet V8, despite its valiant efforts to stay relevant, became an afterthought in the face of the brand's demise. Most of these cars were either sold off, scrapped, or left to rust in junkyards. Many of them, despite their racing heritage and potential as performance cars, were forgotten by the general public. When AMC took over, the Hornet name was briefly revived, but the car's racing legacy and its place in automotive history were lost in the transition. Today, the 1955 Hudson Hornet V8 is a rare sight, and finding one in good condition is nearly impossible. The cars that survived were often neglected, with their unique features and racing pedigree fading into obscurity. The majority of these cars never had the chance to become the collector's items they might have been if Hudson had been able to stay afloat. But for those who remember, the 1955 Hornet V8 stands as a symbol of a bygone era, a time when the underdog could still compete and even dominate, only to be swept away by the inevitable march of time and progress. The Hornet V8's demise also marked the end of Hudson's dominance in NASCAR and its overall presence in American automotive culture. The company that had once produced some of the most advanced and competitive cars on the market was now gone, and with it, the legacy of the Hornet. But the story of the Hornet is one of tragedy and missed opportunities. Had Hudson been able to adapt more quickly to the changing market, perhaps we would be looking at the Hornet today as a revered classic, not a forgotten relic of a brand that was unable to survive. Today, the 1955 Hudson Hornet V8 remains a rare gem for classic car enthusiasts. It's a car that exemplifies what could have been, a model that could have helped Hudson regain its footing in the automotive world. Instead, it stands as a bittersweet reminder of a brand that once soared to great heights, but was ultimately grounded by forces beyond its control. It's a car that represents both the end of an era and the unfulfilled potential of a company that was ahead of its time but simply couldn't keep up with the changing automotive landscape. The 1965 Pontiac 2+2 was one of those cars that had all the ingredients to become a classic muscle car, but for various reasons, never gained the lasting recognition it deserved. At its core, it was a full-size car that packed a punch with its massive Ford 21 cubic inch V8 engine, but its size and the era it was introduced in worked against it. Despite having a powerful engine that made it a true contender in the muscle car race, the 2+2 was overshadowed by its smaller, more agile sibling, the Pontiac GTO, and eventually faded into near obscurity. The Pontiac 2+2 was part of the full-size Catalina lineup and aimed to offer performance that could rival the GTO. Pontiac, known for its performance-driven vehicles, injected the 2+2 with the same big block engine that made the GTO so legendary. The 421 V8 under the hood was capable of producing 356 horsepower, a substantial amount for the time, making the 2+2 more than just a comfortable cruiser. It was a bona fide muscle car. With its powerful engine, the 2+2 could hold its own on the street, providing a combination of raw power and luxury that was rare at the time. Yet, the 2+2's full-size body made it a difficult sell in an era when muscle cars were defined by their smaller, leaner frames. Muscle cars like the GTO, the Mustang, and the Chevelle all had one thing in common. They were compact and nimble, designed to be quick on the streets and on the drag strip. The 2+2, by contrast, was a large, relatively heavy car that couldn't quite match the agility of the smaller cars that were becoming the darlings of the muscle car market. Despite its big block engine, it just didn't have the same sharp handling and aggressive stance that made the GTO and other similar cars so popular. Another key factor in the 2+2's decline was Pontiac's marketing and branding. While Pontiac pushed the GTO as the muscle car of the moment, the 2+2 was never given the same attention or recognition. The GTO was aimed at a younger audience, promoting its sporty nature and fast performance, while the 2+2 was marketed as a more luxurious option, one that combined performance with comfort. Unfortunately, during the 1960s, muscle car buyers weren't looking for luxury in their performance cars. They wanted speed, power, and excitement, not the additional weight and features that came with a larger car. As the 1960s progressed, the muscle car era began to shift. New emissions laws and insurance rates started taking their toll on the performance car market. Pontiac, like many other manufacturers, began to scale back on the more powerful versions of their cars, and the 2+2 was left by the wayside. By the end of 1970, the 2+2 had faded from the Pontiac lineup, with the GTO continuing to carry the muscle car banner for the brand. Over the years, most of these cars were used up, stripped, or scrapped, with few surviving in decent condition. The full-size muscle car never caught on the way the compact muscle cars did, and as a result, the 2+2 was left behind. Today, finding a well-preserved 1965 Pontiac 2+2 is a rare treat for collectors and car enthusiasts. Many of these cars were just driven into the ground or abandoned, with little interest from collectors who were focused on the more famous GTOs, Mustangs, and Chevelles of the time. When you think about the Pontiac 2+2 today, it's hard not to see it as a car that was ahead of its time but never quite given the chance to shine. With its big block power, stylish good looks, and unique place in Pontiac's performance lineup, it was a worthy contender in the muscle car race. Unfortunately, it was overshadowed by smaller, more nimble cars that captured the hearts and minds of muscle car fans. But that doesn't mean the 2+2 didn't have something special. It was the big block GTO that nobody remembered, the full-size muscle car that never found its audience. And while it may not have been the most successful car in Pontiac's muscle car legacy, it remains a fascinating piece of automotive history, one that offers a glimpse into what could have been if full-size muscle cars had caught on in the same way their compact cousins did. In many ways, the 1965 Pontiac 2+2 is a forgotten legend of the muscle car era, a car that had all the right ingredients but just couldn't find its place in the fast-moving world of 1960s muscle cars. For those who know about it, it remains a rare gem, a true testament to the idea that not all great cars get the recognition they deserve, and some legends fade into obscurity only to be remembered by those who truly appreciate their unique qualities. The 1971 Ford LTD convertible was part of a once thriving segment of the American car market, luxury full-size convertibles. These cars were a symbol of the 70s, a time when American automakers were producing large, stylish drop-tops for consumers who wanted both comfort and freedom on the open road. But by the time the decade progressed, the market for these massive convertibles started to collapse. The LTD, despite being a luxurious and well-equipped vehicle, was caught in this shift and quickly faded into obscurity. The LTD convertible was the epitome of 1970s American luxury, offering a smooth ride, ample interior space, and a V8 engine that could cruise effortlessly down the highway. With its long, flowing lines and spacious interior, the LTD was designed to be a leisurely, stylish car. The 1971 model year marked the last of the Ford LTD convertibles, a car that exemplified the classic American full-size convertible that was popular in the post-war years and into the 1960s. With its upscale features, plush seating, and an engine powerful enough to glide down any highway, it embodied the spirit of American automotive luxury. But by the early 70s, things began to change. As the oil crisis loomed, gas prices soared, and the muscle car era began to wind down. Gas-guzzling full-size convertibles, which were once the epitome of cool, quickly became impractical for many consumers who were now more focused on fuel efficiency and smaller vehicles. The rise of the personal luxury coupe, cars like the Buick Riviera and the Ford Mustang, offered a more compact, efficient, and affordable option for those seeking style and luxury without the bulk of a full-size convertible. The appeal of massive drop-tops like the LTD quickly diminished, and Ford, like many other manufacturers, was forced to pull back on their production. The 1971 Ford LTD convertible, while still being a part of Ford's luxury lineup, was already facing an uphill battle against changing consumer tastes. By the mid-70s, these big luxury convertibles were a rare sight. The LTD was discontinued in 1972, and with it, the era of the full-size luxury convertible came to a close. Most of these cars were either scrapped or abandoned, victims of the changing times. The few that did survive often ended up being neglected or rusted away. Despite being an incredible piece of automotive history, the LTD convertible's status as a big, impractical car meant it couldn't survive in the shifting landscape of the American car market. Today, the 1971 Ford LTD convertible is an incredibly rare find. The handful of survivors are often in rough shape, and the car has been relegated to the annals of forgotten American luxury. For car collectors, it remains a reminder of a time when large, flashy convertibles ruled the highways. But it also serves as a symbol of how quickly tastes can change in the automotive world. What was once the height of luxury and style was soon abandoned as smaller, more practical cars became the preferred choice. Despite its relative lack of fame, the LTD convertible has a certain charm. It's a reminder of a time when cars were seen as an expression of personal freedom, where a long, open road was just as much about the journey as it was about the car itself. The 1971 LTD convertible may not have been the most popular or most enduring of Ford's offerings, but it was a key part of the American automobile story, one that faded away almost as quickly as it arrived. Finding one today is a true rarity. The LTD convertible is a car that has slipped through the cracks of automotive history, a luxury drop-top that once symbolized freedom, leisure, and the open road. It's now a fading memory, a piece of 70s automotive nostalgia that only the most dedicated enthusiasts can truly appreciate. And while it may never reach the heights of the classic Mustangs, Chevelles, or GTOs, the 1971 Ford LTD convertible will always have its place in the hearts of those who remember the golden age of American full-size luxury cars. The 1967 Rambler Rebel SST stands as a testament to the fact that sometimes the most deserving cars get lost in the shuffle of automotive history. While it wasn't part of the mainstream muscle car lineup like the Ford Mustang, Chevy Camaro, or Dodge Charger, the Rebel SST, produced by American Motors Corporation, AMC, offered up performance and styling that could hold its own against some of the era's best. Yet, despite its capabilities, the Rebel SST never received the kind of recognition or preservation that its contemporaries did. Today, this once promising muscle car is a rare sight, with most examples having been forgotten or left to deteriorate over time. When AMC launched the Rebel SST in E67, the muscle car era was in full swing. Ford had the Mustang, Chevy had the Camaro, and Dodge had the Charger. These cars were not just popular, they had become cultural icons. But AMC, a company that had long been considered the underdog, had a vision. The Rebel SST was the company's attempt to break into the muscle car market, and it did so with impressive specifications. The Rebel SST was equipped with a 343 cubic inch V8 engine, a power plant capable of producing 280 horsepower. This engine gave the SST a notable performance edge, allowing it to compete with the muscle cars from the big three automakers, offering excellent acceleration and a satisfying driving experience. What set the Rebel SST apart from the other muscle cars was its subtlety. Unlike the Mustang, which was a compact, sporty car, or the Charger, which exuded a bold and aggressive look, the Rebel SST had a more restrained, somewhat understated presence. The Rebel was a full-size sedan that was dressed in sportier trim, making it more of a sleeper car, something that could surprise other muscle cars on the road when push came to shove. The Rebel SST wasn't flashy, it didn't try to scream for attention. Instead, it relied on its performance to make a statement. The SST trim offered a sportier appearance, with unique styling touches like special body stripes, a blacked-out grille, and a more aggressive stance. The interior was more refined than you'd expect for a performance car, with bucket seats and a center console, offering a balance of comfort and utility. The problem, however, was that AMC never managed to market the Rebel SST in a way that could compete with its more well-known rivals. While the Mustang and Camaro were becoming iconic, the Rebel SST didn't have the same widespread appeal or the brand power to match it. At the time, AMC was seen as a niche automaker, an underdog that couldn't rival the powerhouses of Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler. Although AMC offered some great cars, they lacked the same level of visibility and advertising muscle that the other manufacturers had. As a result, the Rebel SST never attracted the level of enthusiasm or cult following that the more famous muscle cars did. When muscle cars began to fade away in the early 70s, the Rebel SST was among the first to disappear from the scene. The changing automotive landscape, with rising insurance premiums, stricter emissions regulations, and shifting consumer preferences, made performance cars less desirable. The market for muscle cars waned, and cars like the Rebel SST were either junked or forgotten. AMC's reputation as a niche manufacturer meant that fewer people thought to preserve their cars, and many examples of the Rebel SST were left to rust away or were discarded without a second thought. Today, the 1967 Rebel SST is a rare and almost forgotten relic of the muscle car era. While cars like the Mustang, Camaro, and GTO are still revered, the Rebel SST has faded into obscurity. Even at AMC-specific car shows, the Rebel SST is a rarity. Enthusiasts who are passionate about AMC and its history might appreciate the SST for what it was, a genuine muscle car that just didn't get its due. But for most car enthusiasts, the Rebel SST remains an afterthought. It's an example of what could have been an overlooked muscle car that was overshadowed by bigger names, lost to time, and unfortunately left out of the broader narrative of American performance cars. In terms of numbers, the Rebel SST was never produced in large quantities, and many of those that were made have since been scrapped, either due to rust, accidents, or simply being overlooked in the rush for more famous muscle cars. Today, spotting a Rebel SST is a rare occasion. The few that have survived are often tucked away in private collections, hiding from public view. For those lucky enough to come across one, it's a reminder of what was possible, a performance car that could hold its own on the streets, but ultimately faded into the background of muscle car history. Finding one in decent condition is an even rarer feat. The Rebel SST's limited production numbers and the lack of preservation by collectors mean that very few examples are left. In fact,